Hello, welcome to Nature Source Care. This is Dr. Funda Goldman. I am a naturopathic physician, meaning that I specialize in treating disease with natural therapies. Today, I'd like to talk to you about foods that increase the element of fire. You can also think of this as inflammation. And basically, what we're going to be going through is the Ayurvedic concept of Pitta. So, a note of caution before we get too deep into this. The information presented here is intended for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. For individual medical advice or if symptoms are severe or worsening, please seek a qualified healthcare professional. So let's begin with what is Ayurveda. I mentioned that this is about the Ayurvedic concept of Pitta. So what is Ayurveda first? This is also known as traditional Indian medicine. Traditional Indian medicine is over 5,000 years old, and they have a deep foundation of knowledge about food and how it affects both the body and the mind, which is quite unique. And as part of this paradigm, they include the energetics of food. So different foods can be warming or cooling or neutral. So they include that in this paradigm. And what's also really great about Ayurveda is that they really focus on whole food versus food chemistry, which is a lot more of the information that's coming from Western paradigm of nutrition. So we're not just talking about when you take a food and parcel it into its molecular components, in a test tube, what can that potentially do for your health? But we're talking about how does one decide, when do you take in ginger, when do you take in cinnamon, when do you take in mint? So as a whole food. The other thing about Ayurveda is they talk about not just what to eat, but how to eat and when to eat as a way to optimize your health. And one of the things I really appreciate about Ayurveda is that because it's 5,000 years old, this is a really deep tradition of knowledge and it's timeless. So even though it's 5,000 years old, it's very relevant to today. I see it work very well with many of my patients. And this is in contrast to a lot of the diets coming through every couple of years. Somebody writes a book and everybody gets excited about it and jumps on that bandwagon. And then a few years later, another person writes a book. And so people at this point I see often are very confused about what to eat because every couple of years somebody is coming up with something new, which is great. It can be innovative and helpful. But again, I just see the Ayurvedic nutrition working so well for so many people. The other thing about Ayurveda is very, very sustainable in terms of how to go about using the information. So, for example, they don't typically cut out whole food categories, which a lot of modern diets do. What they do is they specify within each food category which foods are best for a particular person or situation. So if we look at the pictures over to the right here, we have ginger, we have cinnamon, and we have mint. And maybe you have just a basic concept or intuitive concept about which of these is hottest and which of these is coldest. So just think about it for a minute. And then, so yeah, you would think that the ginger, which is the spiciest, is the hottest. Cinnamon also a little bit warming, and mint is actually cooling. So even between these three spices, you get the general idea or picture of how, especially the energetics of food, can be used in Ayurveda and how you can apply this to individuals who are demonstrating different forms of disease. So we talked about Ayurveda, just to give you a little bit of background. So what is this concept of Pitta within Ayurveda? So within the paradigm of Ayurveda, they consider that people and symptoms are often considered from an elemental point of view. And those elements are wind, or they say Vata, fire, or Pitta, earth, or Kapha. So wind, fire, earth. And among these three, fire is indicated as Pitta. So if you think about fire in general, if you think about a hot stove or a hot flame, what are the qualities of that fire or that Pitta? So it tends to be hot, obviously, very sharp, biting. It can be light, like when there's heat around, right? Things tend to vaporize and things tend to dry out. It kind of lightens things up that are heavier. It can be liquid and spreading like a forest fire spreads, right, quickly if the forest is very dry. Also, the qualities of oily and sour are associated with pitta. And those may not be quite so obvious in the beginning, but once we start talking about foods, you'll understand why those are included in the list of pitta qualities. And just so you understand also, some people naturally have more pitta or fire in their constitution. And the constitution concept in Ayurveda is called prakriti. So if you think of just a few of your friends, even some of them are more intuitively fiery, right? And what makes them fiery? You know, some people are just a little bit more energized or a little bit more intense or a little bit more focused or goal oriented. These sorts of qualities within people, behaviors within people, are considered pitta qualities. Okay. So, and the amount of pitta in anything or anyone can be light in concept to very intense. So you can contrast the idea of like a warm summer breeze, which can be very gentle and warming and soothing, to a huge blazing California forest fire where there's just too much pitta, too much fire, and it's actually being destructive. So you can actually think about that a warm summer breeze versus a California forest fire. Some people within their bodies and even within their minds have way too much fire and it's causing symptoms and disease. And everybody has some pitta to some degree, and everything has some pitta to some degree. It's just a matter of making sure that it's balanced. So Pitta at its best, again, we're going to be talking a lot today about when Pitta is in excess and how to change foods to decrease the amount of Pitta to help with health and balance. But when Pitta is at its best, as I mentioned, Pitta people, people who tend to have more Pitta or have a Pitta type constitution, and people can be a mixed type. They can be a mix of wind and fire, fire and earth, not just full Pitta, just so you have that in your mind as well as we go forward. But Pitta people tend to be very goal oriented. They like to get things done. They're go to people, they're can do people. You know, they're sort of the action oriented people, mostly of the three types wind, fire, and earth. They also tend to be very organized. They in various ways. They tend to also have a lot of courage. Again, that fiery concept, you know, that sort of intensity and the sort of spreading quality. It not just occurs in disease like a spreading rash, but people who have a lot of pitta in their constitution, their makeup, they tend to kind of spread their influence around. That's just part of their nature. Pitta people also tend to have a very strong and perceptive mind. So they tend to pick up things very quickly and they tend to organize things within their mind. So they have that tendency. They can be inspired leaders. So if you think about people like Mohandas K. Gandhi or MLK, those two men had a lot of fire to accomplish what they accomplished in terms of emancipating people from the social, political, cultural structures that were holding people back. You know, you need that fire, you need that intensity, you need that focus to accomplish big things like that in the world. Pitta people also tend to be great administrators, again, because they're goal oriented, they're organized, they like to get things done. Most athletes have a good amount of Pitta in their constitution. You know, they need that fire to stay focused and to keep going through the routines to build up their strength and stamina. Pitta people also tend to be a bit competitive. So that's all part of the Pitta qualities showing themselves, demonstrating themselves in people. Pitta people also tend to be pioneers. They like to be first. They tend to be first. Again, this sort of draws back to this idea of being organized and goal oriented and courageous. They also tend to be really great teachers, again, because they're organized in their actions and in their thoughts, and they have a strong perceptive mind. They tend to be great orators. So that translates very well for somebody who is in front of a classroom, in front of people, influencing people and helping them develop their own minds. And again, when Pitta is at its best, Pitta people, the sun is warm, heat is warm, so they tend to have warm personalities, and they can be cheerleaders. They're very enthusiastic. They tend to help motivate and energize other people. So again, this is Pitta at its best. So just to make sure that, again, most of the slides following this, we're going to be talking about Pitta in excess. And just so you don't get the idea all Pitta is bad, actually everybody has some amount of Pitta. Pitta is important. Everybody needs a certain amount of Pitta. But we're talking here in the following slides about when Pitta is in excess and causing a problem with people. So here we go, Pitta in excess. So when there's too much fire, you can actually see this often. And this mostly demonstrates as too much inflammation of all kinds anywhere in the body and the mind. So we have a picture here of a little bit of poison ivy. So when we see something like this, a rash like this that's red and inflamed, we even call it angry skin, right? So there's some intuitive concept that's translating through these paradigms. And this kind of inflammation can show up anywhere in the body. So skin, for example, can be acne, can be rashes. If we look at the digestive system, reflux, so a burning sensation often happens in the esophagus, colitis, so burning in the colon. People with Pitta also tend to be hypoglycemic. And the reason why is they have so much fire in their metabolism is that they burn through sugar, they burn through food pretty fast. And so this can show up as hypoglycemia because they're burning up their sugar intake too fast. It can also show up as diarrhea because they're kind of burning their food too fast and not absorbing what they can out of it. Jaundice, a lot of liver complaints are associated with too much Pitta, fever, and infections. Again, these are conditions that, a fever directly translates as too much heat in the body. Infections, there's often too much heat in the body. Not always, sometimes people can get cold, but many infections are associated with too much heat. A lot of autoimmune disease, basically your immune system during one of these situations is overactive. And so your immune system, which is designed to help protect you against things like bacteria and viruses, is working too hard and extending beyond its proper boundaries and actually attacking your own healthy tissues. So that's an indication of too much Pitta in the person. Many types of arthritis, hot, swollen, aching joints. Usually there's some Pitta involved with arthritis, although there can be different kinds of arthritis, wind arthritis and earth arthritis as well. But most arthritis has some component of Pitta in it. A lot of blood disorders, like anemia, for example, are a sign of too much Pitta. Bleeding disorders in general are a sign of too much Pitta. Problems also with the eyesight, a lot of eyesight problems, because again, the eyes are one of the ways that you perceive the world. And so because Pitta involves perception, when there's too much Pitta, there are going to be problems with perception through the eyes. And this can also extend to other sensory processes. So, touch, for example, and smell and hearing, but predominantly through eyesight. There's a really strong connection between too much Pitta and eyesight. Too much Pitta can also show up as hair loss or actually early graying for people. You can almost think of it as somebody who has too much heat. It kind of burns the top of their head and burns their hair. That's a metaphor, of course, but you can kind of think about it that way. People with too much Pitta, they also tend to be extremely sensitive to heat and light and the sun and chemicals, because a lot of chemicals cause heat in the body, so they tend to be the most chemically sensitive. So any form of heat, they tend to be very sensitive to. And in the mind, when people have too much Pitta, they tend towards irritation, anger. They can be controlling and rigid. So that's when the organization factor gets a little too out of hand and too excessive. And their anger and their need for control can turn into hate or extreme competitiveness that's actually destructive. So this is, again, we're talking about Pitta in excess. This is Pitta in excess. What helps this And there are things that actually increase Pitta. I already mentioned things that are already warm, but certain foods can increase Pitta. Hot weather increases Pitta. So the information I'm presenting here actually is especially helpful during hot summer months for people, or people who live in hot climates all year round. Um, you know, doing too much in certain activities and even the way they do activities. So, like if they exercise, if they get overly concerned with or focused on achieving goals and they're not listening to their body and what their body really needs in the moment, their minds can be so strong that they kind of override their body signals and then they end up in trouble because they burn out or they injure themselves. Certain pathogens, so that gets back to the idea of infection. So a lot of bacteria, viruses, fungal infections, even allergies. This is a sign, again, when the inflammation shows up, it's a sign of too much pitta. And injuries too. So if somebody injures their knee and then there's a lot of pain and swelling and inflammation, that's another way to increase pitta. And the way to decrease pitta when these things are, out of balance is you want to impose or bring in the opposite qualities. So on the previous slide, when we were talking about hot and sharp and liquid and spreading, you want the opposite quality. So you want cooling and moderate and gentle. Yeah. So you'll see when we start talking about specific foods and food categories, how this translates into nutrition. Before we get into the food categories, though, let's talk about tastes and pitta. So in Ayurveda also, they talk about 6 predominant tastes. So sour, salty, pungent, which means spicy, sweet, astringent, and bitter. And just like they define or categorize people and diseases as predominantly wind, fire, and earth types, they actually use those the elements, to break down the taste. So if we look at the sour taste, if you look at the column on the left here first, the sour taste is made up of earth and fire. Okay, so just consider that for a moment. The salty taste is made up of water and fire. And the pungent or spicy taste is made up of air and fire. So all 3 of these tastes, sour, salty, and pungent, all have part of their makeup being fire. So because they have part of their makeup being fire, these are typically the foods to decrease or avoid with pitta when there's an excess of pitta, because they increase pitta because part of their elemental makeup is fiery. Okay, so then if we look at the right category here, the other 3 flavors, sweet, astringent, and bitter, sweet is made up of the elements earth and water. So you can see that being very grounding. Astringent is earth and air, right? So that's why like astringent things actually kind of draw proteins together and kind of fortify tissues. And bitter is air and ether. So none of these tastes, sweet, astringent, and bitter, have as part of their elemental makeup fire. So these tastes decreases pitta, and these are the tastes we want to increase in the diet when pitta is in excess. Does that make sense? So when there's too much fire, we want to decrease fiery tastes, and the fiery tastes are sour, salty, and pungent. And to balance all the fire within the body and mind, we want to increase sweet, astringent, and bitter taste. Now, okay, so here we go diving into the food categories. So the first category here is fruit. And if we look at the two columns here, on the left is fruit to avoid or decrease in the diet. And on the right side, we have foods to increase in the diet to balance pitta, bring it down when pitta and inflammation is too high in the body. So if we just look at the first few fruits here, on the left side we have sour apple, on the right side we have sweet apple. On the left side we have sour cherry, on the right side we have sweet cherry. On the left side we have sour pineapple, on the right side we have sweet pineapple. So you can see that sour fruits, all the sour, even though it's the same apple, a sour apple is going to cause more inflammation in the body. because the sour taste, one, from an Ayurvedic point of view, has fire element as part of what makes up that taste. But you can also think of it this way, is that when something's sour, the sour flavor gives you an indication that there's acid in the fruit or in the food. When something's acidic, it's corrosive, right? When you pour acid on something, it burns it up, it causes it to heat, it's just so acid is just generally something you want to avoid if you have a lot of inflammation in the body. So if we keep going with the fruits here, you see also like raspberries, versus blueberries. Well, which one's the more sour berry of the two? Raspberries is more sour. So if you're trying to decrease inflammation, decrease pitta in the body, blueberries would be the better choice. And then if we compare cranberries versus dates, well, which one's the sour one and which one's the sweet one? Cranberries are obviously very sour. It's hard to actually eat a cranberry straight. For most people, they have to put a lot of sugar on it to sort of balance all that sourness. Dates are actually very, very sweet. And then we look at grapefruit versus coconut. So again, grapefruit is a sour fruit, coconut, not so much. Lemons also are sour fruit. Melons are cooling. And then if we look at the last few fruits here on the left column, we have green grapes, green or unripe fruit, and too much fruit. So most green fruits, so some people like to eat green bananas versus ripe bananas, or some people like green papaya versus ripe papaya, or some people like green mango versus ripe mango. All those green fruits and unripe fruits. So you also have to think about a lot of times in modern society, we're not eating things in season. So sometimes fruits that are, frozen, or sometimes they're coming too fast to us through distribution because they're coming from long, far away places. And so the fruit, when it arrives in the grocery store, is actually not quite ripe yet. It's a little bit green. And that greenness is also sour, but it can actually cause griping and irritation and inflammation in the body. And even though I've provided this column of fruits to increase, and these are all sweet fruits, and I'm also showing you over here red grapes and pomegranate. Those are much more cooling and soothing fruits than the other sour fruits, but too much fruit in general. All fruit is acidic to some degree. So for people who are eating a lot of fruit in their diet, they may want to scale back on fruit in general, just because every fruit out there, whether it's a lemon or whether it's a red grape or a sweet apple, there's still some acid in it. That's just the nature of all fruit. So the next category here is vegetables and pitta. So the general idea with vegetables to avoid are vegetables that are pungent or spicy. And the vegetables that are more favorable are sweet and bitter vegetables. So again, this gets back to some of the flavors we talked about a few slides ago. So if we look at the pungent vegetables, so raw onions, raw garlic, raw radishes, those are all like hot, spicy vegetables. When you bite into them, like they give you a little bit of a punch, in your mouth. So also in this category, raw beets and raw carrots. So what's interesting though is that if you take these foods so far and you look at the other column, cooked onions are okay, cooked garlic's okay, cooked radishes, cooked beets, and cooked carrots are okay. So what's the difference? What happens in the cooking process? So all of these vegetables, the five I've mentioned, they get sweeter when you cook them. And when they get sweeter, they move from the pungent category or pungent taste to a sweeter taste. So they're less inflammatory when you cook them. Okay, so sometimes if you take the same vegetable and just cook it, you can, again, depending on the vegetable, you can actually make it more friendly for somebody who has a lot of pitta in their body. Obviously, other things that are hot that should mostly be avoided: hot peppers, hot spicy peppers, habanero, jalapeno. Not a good idea if you already have a lot of heat in your body. Horseradish, mustard greens. These are spicy vegetables. Tomatoes and eggplant. Those are in the Solanaceae family. The Solanaceae family has shown for some people to be correlated with increased rates of arthritis because the Solanaceae chemical within this group of plants, people have been shown to demonstrate toxicity to it if they have too much of it. So that's why these are in this category. Turnips, again, a little bit of a punch when you eat these things, and the greens as well. And corn is actually a heating food and it's drying, so not the best to eat for somebody who has a lot of inflammation. But if you look at the other side, we already talked about the cooked vegetables, but vegetables like asparagus and cilantro and cucumber and fennel, green beans, lettuce, mushrooms, and zucchini, these are, much more mild, much more balanced. These are cooling vegetables and they'll help decrease some of that heat in the body. If we look at grains, so again, the two basic ideas here, grains that should be avoided are heating grains, and this is actually a fairly short list for Pitta. Most grains are okay for Pitta, but there are some exceptions because most grains are cooling, and so that cooling factor balances the heat of Pitta. But let's look at the ones to avoid first. So yeasted products. So why is yeasted products on this list? Well, yeast, any sort of fermentation process, when you ferment any kind of food, so whether it's a pickle or sauerkraut or like sourdough bread or yeasted bread, for example, that process, the side products of that process are acid and gas. And the acid is what we're trying to avoid here because, again, acid is corrosive. So yeasted bread is going to be more heating than a non-yeasted bread. So something like sourdough, yeasted sourdough is going to be more sour and pitta producing than, say, flat pita bread, not pita like like pita bread, let me say that. So, like the sandwich bread that looks like a pocket that you usually eat like Middle Eastern food in. That kind of bread would be, a little less pitta, Ayurvedic pitta producing. A few other grains on this list. Buckwheat is heating. Corn I mentioned, not just as a vegetable in the last slide I mentioned, but as a grain. Millet is also heating. Brown rice and rye are heating grains. On the favorable side, though, amaranth, very helpful. Barley, crackers, again, they're drying so they can kind of soak up some of the liquid that Pitta tends to produce. Oats, quinoa, rice, especially white basmati rice or wild rice, spelt, tapioca, and wheat. These are all cooling grains, and they're also tend to be sweeter in flavor. So again, this gets back to tastes that are more favorable for Pitta, as well as foods that are cooling, soothing, grounding, right? And you can just think about this too. If somebody's like overheated, like physically or in their mind, and they're getting agitated and angry, right? You want to chill them out a little bit, and that's what you want to do for both the body and mind when people have too much Pitta going on. So legumes for the most part are also very favorable for Pitta because for the most part they're cooling and they're drying. So again, that combats the heat and the liquid components of Pitta. There are a few notable ones to avoid though. Again, any sort of fermented type of legume. So miso, tofu, tempeh. These are not, if you have a lot of inflammation in your body, these are not things you want to be eating every day or having be a mainstay in your diet. The occasional miso or tofu or tempeh is okay, but not every day, not a major component. There are also a couple of dals or lentils, Indian lentils, tur dal and urad dal. Those are specifically heating. Those also should be avoided for the most part. The favorable ones, though, almost all beans, almost all lentils, lima beans, mung dal. That's another Indian dal that's quite popular and ubiquitous there. And peas. So all of these legumes are actually very favorable for Pitta because they're both drying and cooling. Dairy. There are some exceptions for the most part. Most dairy is actually good for Pitta because most dairy is cooling and soothing. It has a sweet taste, despite there being like some salt in it. But we'll talk about that. So if we look at the ones or varieties to avoid, so hard aged cheese. Why is this? Well, the longer a cheese sits around fermenting, so again, this gets back to the fermenting idea, the more acid it's going to have in it. So those hard, aged, stinky cheeses, some people love them, and just the qualities of it, right? So intense, right? They're more intense, and Pitta people tend to really love intense foods. So they might like really super spicy foods or really like, this, odorous cheese and stuff like that. They tend to like that stuff. Um, Also, salted butter. So again, salt. We talked about salt a little bit being a taste that's fiery in nature, but salt on its own is a corrosive substance, right? It's like we're driving our cars around all winter and we're driving on roads that have salt on them, and that salt on the roads can corrode the underside of a car. So salt can also corrode us in our bodies. It can cause inflammation. So salt in general is something to be avoided. Sour cream. So, okay, sour, again, not a good idea because sour foods indicate acid. This is also a fermented product. So now you're starting to maybe see the pattern here and why some of these foods tend to be on the avoid list and some are on the favorable list. And yogurt. Well, yogurt's kind of on the line here. Yogurt, it is sour, it is fermented, but it's pretty fresh too. It's not like a deeply aged cheese. So it's actually kind of in both lists if you take a look. So yogurt that's been sitting around a long time in a commercial like plastic bin, we talked about also like chemical sensitivity. Commercial yogurt is more acidic than like yogurt that you make at home. That's like fresh, diluted, and you just like made it overnight. Most people don't make their own yogurt, at least here in the States. So work with what you've got. But, if you're somebody that's eating commercial yogurt every day and a lot of it, that may be part of what's all that acid in the yogurt may be part of what's causing inflammation in your body. So you might want to scale back on the yogurt or, start to make your own yogurt. So it's a little bit less acidic for your body. So if we look at the list of favorable dairy, at least, given this paradigm, right, we're just talking about Ayurveda here. I'm not incorporating other paradigms of nutrition. This is a much longer list. So cottage cheese, although you have to watch with cottage cheese, it tends to be salty. So if you can find a low salt variety, that's better. But the products on this side are like soft, fresh varieties, right? So gentle, moderate dairy, not extreme taste or salt or fermentation. Farmer's cheese or paneer is on this list. Fresh mozzarella, low salt feta. Most feta is actually very salty, and if you're again trying to decrease salt for various reasons, not just because you have too much pitta, but maybe you have high blood pressure, what you can do is usually the feta comes in like a salty brine. You can dump that liquid out and put in fresh water, leave it overnight, and that fresh water will leach out some of the salt with the feta. So that'll decrease the salt content. So that's one way to deal with it. Cow milk is actually very soothing and cooling, so that's helpful for Pitta people and Pitta diseases. Goat milk and cheese is also slightly warming, but the nature of, again, animal dairy is actually soothing and helpful for Pitta. Yogurt, we already talked about. Ghee, which is clarified butter, is cooling, and unsalted butter. So these are the things to really avoid and favor on a Pitta balancing diet. So meat and Pitta. So let's just take a look at the foods on the avoid side first. So beef, lamb, pork, duck, saltwater fish, egg yolks, dark meat of chicken, turkey. All right. So what do these foods, these meats have in common? Well, they tend to be dark in color. Dark meat of animals tends to have more hemoglobin and it tends to be more heating because hemoglobin is a component of blood. Not just from the animal that was consumed, but the person who's eating it, some of those components of meat is going to get incorporated into that person's body. Also, saltwater fish, right? We've been talking about salt. Salt is something you generally want to decrease in a Pitta balancing diet because salt is corrosive. Egg yolks, again, it's kind of interesting here. The darker, not just the grains, we talked about grains too, but the darker the meats are, the more intense they tend to be. Also, these foods like beef, lamb, pork, duck, egg yolks, they tend to be the fattier portions, and even the dark meat of chicken and turkey, they tend to have a fattier percentage or portion of them. And Pitta is really that fire, just like any kind of heat has a very transformative quality. Pitta is needed to break down foods, but if the food is too heavy, you're going to need a lot more pitta to break it down. And these foods that have a lot of dark color in them tend to be like pitta provoking. Okay. So if you don't want to take all these, like, again, intense foods and flavors, which again, a lot of Pitta people love intense food. That's kind of their nature. There's this sort of general theme of intensity in their life and their personality. Um, if you switch over to the favorable side, though, these meats are the lighter, drier versions, for the most part, of the foods on the avoid list. So instead of beef, buffalo. Buffalo has a lot lower fat content. It's a lot easier for the body to digest and process. There's not as much fat that the body has to heat up and process. The white meat of chicken and turkey is a lot easier to digest. It's lighter and drier than the dark meat. Freshwater fish, again, not as much salt as saltwater fish. Egg whites, not there's hardly any fat in egg whites versus egg yolk. That's most of where fat is in egg. Rabbit, venison, shrimp, these tend to be very lean, less fat involved in these meats, and so they're just easier to digest, and they don't tend to provoke pitta, especially in the digestive system, but really anywhere in the body. So nuts and seeds. This one, you might be a little surprised, but most nuts are very hot and fiery, and they're oily. So when people eat a lot of nuts, it's almost like throwing gasoline on a fire for people who have too much pitta and inflammation. So almost all nuts should be avoided or decreased in diet. Also, sesame seeds or tahini, which is crushed sesame seeds, that is also a fiery food. So that increases inflammation in the body, especially if you're eating a lot of it. And chia seeds are also heating. But compared to nuts, most seeds are favorable. The one nut that you can actually kind of take and alter to make it more pitta friendly are almonds. So the dark skin on almonds, that's actually a pretty fiery component of almonds. So if you can peel that off, first soak the almonds so that it cools them down, and then you can get the peels off of them in the morning. Soaked and peeled almonds are less fiery than, say, raw almonds, roasted almonds, almond butter, almond oil. So again, we're talking about nuts and seeds, not just in their whole form, but any product made from nuts and seeds. So like nut flour, like almond flour, hazelnut flour, something like that. That's all included in this category here. So soaked peeled almonds are better, but I tend to steer people towards sunflower seeds, pumpkin seeds, flax seeds, and coconut, because these are all cooling seeds. Most nuts, again, are heating. So these are things you want to be mindful of. Oils and pitta. So if you look at this list, you're probably seeing some themes, and it's kind of tying back with some of the previous slides because a lot of oils are made from vegetables and nuts and seeds. So let's just look at them side by side. So oils to potentially avoid, and the reason why is that these oils tend to be heating, but again, pitta needs to be careful of taking too much oil into their diet in general, because oil, it's again like throwing gasoline on a fire. So oils to avoid: canola oil, corn oil, mustard. Mustard is really corrosive. They actually make warfare weapons out of like mustard oil and gas. I mean, it's a very corrosive thing. If you put mustard oil on your skin, it will actually form blisters. So you don't want to be eating mustard seed or mustard oil if you have a lot of inflammation already. Again, most nut oils, so peanut oil, almond oil, not a good idea. Safflower oil is also heating. Sesame oil, we talked about sesame seeds, so that's obviously a heating oil. And salted butter. Again, we talked about salt, and salt being a corrosive material for not just us, but even like cars. So the oils to favor are cooling oils, so sunflower oil and olive oil. What's nice about sunflower oil is that it does actually have similar heart healthy properties excuse me, as olive oil, but it can take high heat. So you can actually cook and saute with sunflower oil. Olive oil can, at high heat, start to produce toxins. So be careful about how much you're doing with olive oil. I usually just suggest people use it for like salad dressings and stuff where it's not cooked. Also, coconut and avocado, but in whole form, not necessarily coconut oil or avocado oil. And the reason why is not because of Pitta so much as that in Ayurveda, they're generally advocating that people eat, gentle, light foods that's not going to stress out the system. And coconut oil and avocado oil are very heavy. So it's really hard for the body to digest that. And so it can actually start to affect the liver, since the liver is the main organ responsible for breaking down fats. Ghee in small amounts is also okay for Pitta. Flaxseed oil, a little bit of walnut oil is okay. That's probably the only nut oil that's sort of okay for Pitta. Again, you don't want to be eating walnut oil day and night, but the occasional, amount like on a salad, maybe once or twice a week, that's about all you'd want to do with walnut oil. And again, as I mentioned, you don't want to be eating highly oily foods. So fried food is another great way to increase pitta. So if you're trying to decrease pitta, decrease inflammation, you want to steer away from highly oily foods, highly greasy foods, and fried foods. So spices, a lot of people, when they're looking at inflammatory foods, they're looking at kind of something you can actually hold in your hand. They're not necessarily looking at, these little like pinches of spices and stuff. But this can be very, very important for somebody who has high pitta in the body and the mind. I had one patient, she was a middle-aged Indian woman, and she came in with really raw skin on her face, really bad rosacea. It looked really painful, like raw meat. I mean, it was really, I was feeling for her. And, I start talking to her about a pitta diet, and she's Indian, so she's familiar with the concept, but then she looked at me, she's almost like, okay, are you crazy? But, she said, look, I've been eating hot, spicy food my whole life. I don't feel full unless my food is spicy. How am I supposed to do this? So I said, look, if you're putting a whole teaspoon of cayenne pepper in your food, start with doing half of a teaspoon. So you still get a little bit of that punch and flavor that you're used to, but you really want to start rolling this back. So I said, give it a month, do your best with all this information. Let's see how you do. And she came back a month later. All the redness was gone out of her skin. The pain was gone. The swelling was gone. It just, she was flaking though because the skin was turning over. So she still had, a little bit of a visual, change in her skin, but that's because the skin was like healing and turning over. It wasn't because there was like a huge amount of obvious inflammation in her face. So spices, especially for pitta, are really, really key. So let's look at the avoid list here. And again, these are hot, pungent spices, really spicy, heating things. Ajwan, that's in the celery seed. It's like in the celery family. That's a spice they typically use in India. That's really heating. Allspice, almond extract, anise, asafoetida, basil, dry basil. Actually, fresh basil is a little bit it's not as heating. So dry basil, because sometimes when these spices dry up, they get more concentrated and hotter. And sometimes, like with garlic, it's the opposite. When you cook it, it becomes sweeter. So look on both lists to see which is best. So dry basil is more pungent than fresh basil. Cayenne pepper, fenugreek, these are also too hot for most pitta people. Raw garlic, dry ginger. Again, there's a difference with dry ginger versus fresh ginger. People who are super, super pitta, they should probably even avoid fresh ginger for a while until they calm down. But once they're in more of a steady state, they can do a little bit of fresh ginger in their diet. Marjoram, mustard, I talked about already, super corrosive, blistering to the skin. You don't want to be eating that. in any form. The other thing to note, I had another patient who she came in with a kid who had hives, about a year and a half years old. The kid was already seeing an allergist. They were giving the kid Benadryl every other day, even with the allergy stuff, conventional allergy stuff. And then they come in, they're like, what else can you help us with? What else do you have? And so I gave them basically a Pitta diet. Um, and, you know, the kid, went from taking Benadryl every other day to only needing Benadryl twice in the next month once they did the diet. And I'd have to say also that like the family wasn't like entirely on board. Like they were still skeptical when they heard this because it was so new to them. So they sort of even like half did it, I would say. But even sort of half doing this diet, took them from giving this kid Benadryl every other day to Benadryl only twice in the month. And the times that they needed the Benadryl, when we looked at what the kid ate in the 24 hours previous to the flare up of the skin, they gave the kid something that was not, on the Pitta friendly list. And they were giving this kid Veganase, which is like a vegan mayonnaise. And they're thinking, okay, vegan mayonnaise, that sounds healthy for a kid. But if you looked, I said, well, let me look at the label here. When I looked at the label, what was in this Veganase? It was mustard oil, it was vinegar, it was, I think, canola oil. So there were a lot of really, for a kid who has hives, you don't want to be feeding them mustard oil. So you really want to be looking at your food labels and the ingredients in them to see what is in these foods that you're taking in, because you might be really surprised by how much, oil or spice or salt or whatever acids, different kinds of acid from citric acid to whatever that are in prepared foods. So really make sure you check that as well. But getting back to this list, so nutmeg, oregano, really spicy. Um, I know my Italian patients are never happy to hear this, but for a while, to get the Pitta down, they really need to bring down the oregano. And then slowly over time, we can start to incorporate a little bit, but they can't go too crazy with oregano, despite their preferences. And again, it's not about cultural background or respecting that, but these foods just do what these foods do, regardless of, your cultural background or social traditions. So, it's food is just food, and this is what the food does in the body, everybody's body. Paprika is also on this list. Poppy seeds also heating. They're also oily, right? Poppy seeds. Rosemary, too hot. Sage, too hot and drying. Salt, we've talked about, a few times already. And thyme. These are spices to avoid if you have inflammation, if you have high pitta. So, what can people who are high pitta, who tend to really like? I mean, I know people who literally carry Tabasco sauce in their purse, in their bag, because they love to pour all that hot, spicy sauce on everything. Not a great idea for pitta people, but what you should do instead, you can still get flavor without the heat. So fresh basil, black pepper's about as hot as you want to go. Caraway, cardamom, cinnamon. So cinnamon's warming, but it's not heating, it's not going to blister your insides. Coriander's cooling, cumin's cooling, cooked garlic, better than raw garlic, fennel, dill. Again, these are middle of the road spices. They have flavor, but you just take that, extract all that super heat out of it. Fresh ginger, I mentioned, better than dry ginger. Mint is cooling. Parsley, a little bit warming, but not too much so. Saffron, tarragon, and vanilla. So those are spices to incorporate in the diet, and the other ones. So beverages, basically this corresponds with the previous slides. So on the avoid list, alcohol, again, fermented, cider, fermented, beverages in general, like kombucha, for example. Too much kombucha, can potentially cause inflammation, especially in the gut. Sour fruit juices, again, refer back to the fruit slide. In contrast to sweet fruit juices, you could do a little bit more of. Caffeine, again, people who are, really strong pitta people, they tend to overdo things. They get into trouble because they're so goal oriented and they have a lot of energy. Um, I hear a lot from people who have a lot of pitta that they have, quote unquote, a high tolerance for pain. That's always sort of a signal for me that they're probably, have a lot of pitta, because pitta people have such a strong mind. They tend to override their natural signals, body signals. And so they get into trouble because they don't listen to pain signals in their body, and they can injure themselves. So for the people who are sort of overactive, overeager, overdoers, who need to like chill out a little bit, the caffeine is just going to rev them up and keep them going. So, that's why caffeine is on this list. Carbonation is on this list because anything carbonated, like even sparkling water, the carbonation is more acidic than just tap water or some mineral waters. So check your water and make sure it's not acidic to some degree. Chocolate is acidic. Yeah, unfortunately, coffee is acidic. Um, iced iced beverages is on everybody's list. Ayurveda does not suggest people drink iced beverages because it disturbs the um, digestive fire. You do need some fire, as I mentioned, and you need some fire to transform your food into digestible and absorbable components. But throwing ice on a fire, your digestive fire, is not a good idea. Tomato juice, again, way too spicy, way too much acid. Also, look at other veggies from the veggie slide that are on the avoid list. You don't want juice made from any of those. And then anything highly spiced. So again, go back to the spice list and look. So a really spicy Bloody Mary that has alcohol, tomato juice, and like cayenne in it. Bad news for people who have too much pitta. But on the favorable side, so almond milk, rice milk, soy milk, these are okay. They're much more mild for people who don't do like animal dairy. Aloe vera, specifically the inner fillet, not the whole leaf. The whole leaf, again, that green part can be a little bit irritating, but the inner fillet is that inner gel that's actually very soothing. That can actually help inflammation quite a bit. Some fruit juices, again, the sweeter ones, the milder ones like apple, blueberry, sweet cherry, grape, and pomegranate. If you do juice, these are the better ones. Black tea is better than coffee. There's a lot less acid in it, and um, black tea, cup for cup, has about a third of the caffeine as coffee. So, for people who like to be supercharged, and are drinking a ton of coffee to keep themselves going because they're trying to cross everything off their task list, downshifting to black tea would be favorable. Carob as an alternative for chocolate. I know they don't taste the same, but just in terms of pitta, carob is going to be a lot less pitta producing than chocolate. Chai, as long as you don't get too spicy with the chai, as long as you're not throwing in like a lot of ajwain or dry ginger or clove, because those are hotter, spicier herbs. If you use like mint instead, or use cinnamon or cardamom and do more of the gentle herbs, you can do chai. Cool dairy drinks, I mentioned a lot on the dairy slide already. Grain coffee, so usually this is made from chicory. That's a lot less acidic and pitch provoking than regular coffee. Miso, you got to be careful a little bit with miso because it is fermented, but occasionally some miso would be okay. And veggie juice, as long as they're favorable pitta balancing juices or veggies like cucumber, cilantro, that sort of thing, those would be okay, versus like tomato juice, for example, or like lemonade, or, not a good idea if you've got a lot of inflammation. Sweeteners. So the general idea with sweeteners is that the sweet taste balances pitta. So a lot of sweeteners actually, as long as they're light and natural, actually help to kind of soothe and chill out pitta. Um, But again, nobody should really be eating that much sugar. It's just not good for your body. And if you eat a lot of sugar, it might be cooling down your pitta, but you might be increasing the earth element or kapha. And people who have too much kapha, they tend towards being overweight, and they tend toward diabetes, because the earth element, those people, those diseases, we tend to see people building things like the earth builds things. So they tend to build blood that's too heavy with cholesterol, and they build blood with too much sugar. and they have lipomas or tumors or too much weight. That's just sort of their natural inclination. So too much sugar for anybody, not a good idea, even if it's light or natural. But if we're just talking about Pitta here in that little, focused idea, the sweeteners that Pitta should avoid, artificial sugar, because again, chemicals, Pitta is the most sensitive to chemicals. Most chemicals are heating to some extent. White sugar actually has bleach in it. Bleach is corrosive and heating, so that's the reason why you want to avoid that if you have high Pitta. Jaggery and molasses, these are kind of deep, dark sugars, and kind of like the meats and some of the other like spices and vegetables, again, they tend to be more intense and dark and deep. And Pitta in general does better with things that are light and moderate and balanced. So you can think of those kind of darker sugars as just too much really for Pitta. If we look at the favorable side, again, if we're looking at light and natural sweeteners, barley malt, fructose, demerara, which is unprocessed sugar, turbinado, which is raw sugar, coconut sugar, honey, agave, maple syrup, rice syrup, date sugar. These sugars are more favorable in moderate, reasonable doses for anybody's diet, but these tend to balance and cool Pitta and inflammation. So there you have it. Hopefully this seminar has helped you open up to a new paradigm and maybe reconsider some of the things you might be doing for yourself, especially regarding nutrition, in terms of decreasing inflammation in your body and helping you achieve better health overall. Thank you for your time and take care.